So, global competency has really become the glue that holds together modern societies. And the World Economic Forum has highlighted the kind of forces that have pushed global competency to the forefront of the debate. You look at climate change, urbanization, the growing middle class in emerging economies, on rising income disparities in virtually all industrialized countries, on the deep demographic shift, on the increasing polarization in our societies, economically and socially, on the weakening of international governance. You put all of this together and you see the kind of profound social instability, interstate conflicts, those kinds of forces that make it more and more important for people to collaborate, compete, and connect in innovative ways, and to learn to see the world through different lenses, to accept different perspectives, different ideas. That's really at the center of this idea of global competency, and that's the dimension that we intend to incorporate in the PISA 2018 assessment. Let me highlight a few of those forces. Now, robots are taking over whole factories in our countries. I mean, jobs are at stake, pushing sort of people to accommodate new ideas, change, bringing globalization to new frontiers. The race between technology and education, as some people are calling it. Think about augmented reality. It is now possible to bring the world's most advanced knowledge in real time into anything that we do in any place. Globalization is no longer something for people who go to other countries, who travel. Globalization has arrived at the doorsteps of everyone. The knowledge that we have today is really becoming everybody's business. Inequalities, I've already highlighted. In every country for which we have data, almost every country, we've seen rises in inequalities, economic inequalities, social inequalities. Social challenges for our schools. If you think about single-person households, they used to be, or they are, a tough kind of circumstance for many schools today. Well, if they are today, how is this going to look in 2025 or 2030? When in many countries, that's going to be almost the norm, no longer an exception. Everyone wants to live in advanced economies. You can see the dramatic expansion of immigration. People look at this through the context of the current refugee crisis. Yes, sure, but it's been an ongoing trend for many decades. The increasing diversity of classrooms, of schools, is something that we just have to take on in much more proactive ways. It's no longer something that people can add with adding a specialist into schools. It's something that affects everyone's classroom education. You can look at this by country. You take countries like Luxembourg, Switzerland, Australia, Israel. We talk about a very, very large share of young people here, 15 to 34-year-olds, who have a migration background in one or the other form, either because they are native foreign born, because they arrived as children, they arrived as adults. So you put it all together, and you can see really how migration, increasing diversity, has become sort of major kind of context for education and learning today. And again, it's no longer about those people who move physically. The ideas, the knowledge, the cultures are moving in ways that basically affect everyone today. So some people think that's all, outside the realm of education. There's not much schools can really do about it. But I want to highlight the role of education on the example of immigration. On this chart, you see the performance, learning outcomes of first-generation immigrant students from Turkey, basically people who have come during their childhood to a new country of destination. And you can see basically those first-generation immigrants from Turkey do a little bit better in Netherlands and Denmark, but in most countries, they score sort of quite similarly. But you look at the performance of second-generation immigrants, the children of immigrants, you can see how hugely the performance of those children varies, even after accounting for socioeconomic context. So these are people from the same country of origin, from a similar social background, but depending on where they go to school, they come out so differently. And that suggests, the diversity from the country of origin does have an impact on learning outcomes. But where people go to school matters a lot more. You compare Germany and Switzerland. The first generation, they come out more or less in the same place, and it's not a surprise because they have similar kind of systems. The people from Turkey are the same. But in the second generation, you can see how Switzerland suddenly is a school year ahead of Germans. Huge differences in the way in which people are integrated in their host communities. You look at Denmark. In the first generation, they seem to be doing really well. In the second generation, they're actually not doing particularly well. Let's have a look at this in another way. Here you have students from the Arab-speaking countries. And you can see in the Netherlands, they come out really well. In the UAE, so Denmark, Finland, not so well. In Qatar, actually quite poorly. You take students from China. They do well wherever you put them. So actually, you can see from this country of origin actually does matter in terms of student performance. But the country of destination, as you could see before, matters even more. And I want to actually highlight another dimension. We can talk about academic integration, and that's something that we have put a lot of emphasis on, ensuring that students, from different countries do well in school in terms of math, science, literacy, history, and so on. But actually, we started to look at other dimensions as well. We call it the sense of belonging, the sense whether students feel school is a place where they're at home, where they're accepted, where they're welcomed by people who are different from them. And when you look at this actually, academic integration, what so far has been the norm, is not a guarantee for social integration. Finland is doing only so-so when it comes to academic integration, but it does really well in giving students from Arab-speaking countries a sense of belonging, feeling welcome at home. If you look at Denmark, doing a little bit better, sort of so-so in academic integration, coming out really poorly on the social integration. The reason I'm showing you this is simply to say that schools can make a difference, or host countries can make a difference. Whatever the context is, public policy can be an important driver of the extent to which we integrate people with differences in backgrounds. Schools can provide powerful opportunities for people to learn about global development. That's the place where you hear and study phenomena that may be affecting your lives, but that you're not aware of. Teaching students how they can develop a critical worldview of today. It's the role of good teaching, critical thinking. Equip students with the means to access and analyze a range of cultural practices, understanding their meanings. Promoting the value of diversity. Again, and if people understand the value of diversity, the potential of diversity, they will be more sensitive to diversity and be more respectful. They will be not just tolerating differences, but appreciate them. Schools can be a very powerful driver of these kinds of global competencies. And that has brought us to look at that in PISA. PISA is the yardstick for success in education globally. So if our global societies express new demands, including global competencies, it is important that they are mirrored in the way in which we measure success. That's really what we are trying to do, and I just want to sort of highlight the definition of global competencies. And before I lead you through this, I want to stress that this is really an overarching frame of reference that looks at multiple cognitive, social, even emotional components that are always mediated by the belief that diversity should be valued. That's very, very important. The question of values, I'm going to come back to this later, of course, underlines the issue of global competencies. We take a stake in this, and that we really believe that valuing diversity is the underlying sort of paradigm of global competency. Let's have a look at the definition of global competency in more detail. We define global competency as the capacity to analyze global and intercultural issues critically and from multiple perspectives, to understand how differences affect perceptions, judgments, and ideas of myself and others, and to engage in open, appropriate, and effective interactions with others from different backgrounds on the basis of a shared respect for human dignity. That's the value dimension. Let me stress what I mean by open here. Open is that all participants in the interaction demonstrate sensitivity towards, and also curiosity and willingness to engage with people who are different in their own perspective. Appropriate is really about all participants in the situation being equally satisfied, that the kind of interaction occurs within what we accept as cultural norms. That's the definition that is underlying the PISA assessment, and now you can of course ask, how are we going to measure this? The first thing that you come to is that actually competency is always sort of a combination of different facets. It has to do with knowledge, knowing something, but also understanding. Understanding goes a bit deeper than knowledge. Knowledge is information. Understanding is about deriving meaning from that knowledge. But knowing something doesn't mean that I can do something about it. The skills dimension is very important. And always skills and knowledge are framed by the capacity to mobilize the cognitive, social, and emotional resources that I have in a given context. And that's where attitudes come into play. And competences really bring all of this together to drive action. People debate those kinds of frameworks. Other people have come up with other kinds of organizing frameworks, but that's the one that we have developed for the PISA assessment. Let me sort of talk about those dimensions in a little bit more detail. Knowledge and understanding here are perhaps the most obvious part. I need to know something about the world. I need to sort of take an interest in this. Also on the intercultural dimension of this. I think that's something probably which everyone would take for granted. But what about skills? The capacity to think critically, analytically, to interact respectfully, appropriately, effectively, the kind of things that I mentioned in the definition. Well, we define skills as the capacities for carrying out a complex pattern of either thinking, that's when we talk about cognitive skills, or behaviors. That's when we talk about social and emotional skills, in order to achieve something. When you translate that into a global competency, you can think about numerous skills, including the ability to communicate in multiple languages, to understand somebody else's ways of expressing themselves, to communicate appropriately and effectively with people who think differently, come from other cultures, other countries, to comprehend other people's thoughts, beliefs, feelings, see the world from different perspectives, adjust my own thoughts, feelings, or behaviors to fit the new context and situations, and to analyze and think critically in order to analyze, scrutinize, appraise information and meanings. It's a challenge today. You go on Google, you go on the internet, you can see everything and more. And your capacity to navigate, to have this kind of compass and the navigation skills that allows you to construct meaning, that's really absolutely central to this. But I also want to talk a bit about the attitude dimension. Openness towards people from other cultures, respect for cultural otherness, global-mindedness, responsibility. You may know a lot, you may have the skills to do something about it, but if you lack the disposition to actually mobilize your knowledge and skills, they're not going to be very useful for you. So we define attitude as the overall mindset which somebody adopts, and which typically consists of, a belief or opinion about something, an emotion or feeling towards something, an evaluation, either positive or negative, and a tendency to actually behave in a particular way towards that something. That's how we look at attitudes in the global competency assessment. And the first two components, knowledge and understanding and skill, that's what we're trying to test directly. Build metrics that measure those things directly. When it comes to the attitudes, there we try to reflect them indirectly by giving students questions, where they have to answer questions on specific situations. Let me talk about about this in more detail. And I have my colleague Mario Piacenzi with me here, who is actually the mastermind of the instrumentation of this. He can talk a lot more in more deeper about how do we actually construct measures and questionnaires about this. Let me talk sort of in global sort of terms about the instruments. There's a test, as you used for PISA, some metric that actually directly measures knowledge and skills. And then there will be self-reported information where we look at the capacity of students to interact with different people, empathy, flexibility, openness towards other cultures. Now, those things we haven't yet found ways to directly measure, and that's why we have to rely on those kinds of self-reported metrics. The cognitive test, rooted in content, global issues, intercultural issues. We basically ask students to apply that knowledge, to critically digest, process that knowledge, come up with their own creative solutions, and to demonstrate global and intercultural understanding. Now, that's essentially what the test will do, like almost any PISA test. That's actually sort of the hallmark of the PISA assessment. PISA is never very much focused on simply the reproduction of subject matter content or specific information. Is always about the capacity of individuals to extrapolate from what they know, to apply their knowledge creatively in novel situations. In that sense, global competency fits really well into the philosophy of PISA. But the outcome here is not about thinking mathematically or scientifically, but about global and intercultural understanding. That's the test part. So basically, students would read a case study on a global or intercultural issue. They would use their knowledge and critical thinking and then answer questions about a situation. We can actually talk, if we have time left, some of the examples that we're using for this. But actually, we've been able to develop some really interesting contexts in which students can see themselves confronted with different ideas, perspectives, cultures, and then they have to develop a stance, their own stance about a given situation. Now, we want to actually test this whether students have knowledge and critical understanding of selves, have knowledge and critical understanding of cultural issues, of global issues, and of communication in intercultural context. Now, that's the kind of meta competency of being able to see yourself in relating with others. We want to assess evidence on global issues in a balanced and reflective way. It's a very tough issue. When people come from different contexts, different cultures, giving them meaningful tasks that we can actually compare and contrast. I must actually say, we had very, very similar debates when PISA was initiated. Reading literacy is not so different in this respect. Literacy can mean something very different in different cultural contexts. Tools for literacy, language, varies hugely across countries and cultures. So this is an issue which follows us in whatever way we assess. Can students produce reasoned arguments on global issues based on evidence rather than popular beliefs? Can they recognize, understand cultural stereotypes? Things that are simplifications, oversimplifications of complex phenomena. Can they actually sort of get to the bottom of it? Can they identify solutions for issues in local and global context? Can they distinguish between facts and assertions on global issues and cultural differences? Think about it. That distinction is so much at the heart of many of the conflicts that we encounter today. So those are the dimensions that we hope to be able to test and ultimately to scale. The idea is to report the results on a multidimensional scale that looks at the extent to which students are able to use their knowledge, understanding meanings, recognize relationships and perspectives, think critically about global or intercultural issues. Now that's sort of the kind of multidimensional PISA scale that we expect to hope to come out of this. The test is going to include a number of constructed response items where students have to produce their own knowledge. Multiple choice tasks are not that helpful for an assessment like this because we want to actually see to which students can actually produce their own answers. But of course, we have to take care that we can score those responses in ways that are valid across countries and cultures. But again, this is an area where PISA has developed 15 years of experience, And I think we can do a lot today to achieve that. And then, we would use partial credit scoring. That means that responses will not be either wrong or right, not black and white, but, you can give students partial credit for the way in which they have answered the questions and how far they've got in their responses. Some other features of the cognitive test, we hope to base all of the scenarios that we give to students on real news. Obviously, we need to decontextualize them in some ways, to make them understandable to students from around the world. This is going to be 1 hour, a computer-based test. We believe that computer-based assessment is the right approach here because we'll be able to present real-life scenarios to students, maybe put videos and so on, and sort of replicate the kind of cognitive challenges, and in some cases also simulate interactions in the classroom among students. And again, you might think of this being very adventurous, but actually PISA has accumulated a lot of experiences with this already. In the 2015, last year, we did our first assessment of social skills, collaborative problem solving, in which we had to actually do a lot of this already. Well, the big question anybody asks is, who is going to develop the test? And the answer that PISA gives to this is, it's everybody together. We have a very comprehensive process in which the test will be adjudicated by all of the participating countries to make sure that the test is culturally appropriate and linguistically equivalent. It is a long process. People ask us always, why do you need 3 years to develop a test? Well, the answer is that's the time it takes for us to actually make sure that the product that we have will work across contexts. And I must actually say we expect a lot of the variability to capture not to lie between countries. The idea that cultural boundaries are what separates countries is very old-fashioned. Actually, cultural boundaries actually are separating people, are separating classes, schools, social groups. There's a lot we need to learn in order to capture those nuances, not just between, but within countries and within language groups even. We don't want those items, those tasks to capture specific knowledge. For example, what is the language of the indigenous population in Bolivia? But we want to focus on general knowledge, awareness of relevant global and intercultural issues. For example, what's the role of language to promote cultural diversity? That's really the essence of the test and the main features of this. But again, my colleagues can lead you through this in much greater detail. I want to conclude my presentation with the hardest part of it. Is, how do we capture those dimensions that you cannot, at least not today, directly measure in the form of an assessment? Again, I mentioned already, our approach there is to use a questionnaire type. And there are a number of dimensions that we want to actually capture in those questions. The first is knowledge and understanding of intercultural issues. Knowledge, basically, being aware, and understanding is deriving meaning of this. That involves knowledge about my own culture, about other cultures, knowledge about the similarities and differences between different cultures. And this component is not acquired by factual knowledge alone. Again, that's not what we're going to focus on, but rather through the ability to find the meaning of and the connections between different pieces of information. And that's exactly what we mean by understanding and how we differentiate understanding from knowledge. If you think about misconceptions, misconceptions are actually often the result of poor or lacking information. We all learn by creating classification systems. We try to bring order in the world. And if that kind of process is informed by poor knowledge, then we will develop stereotypes, simplifications. And they actually lead to the kind of generalizations that can divide our societies, that can actually work against global competency. So this knowledge and understanding is the foundation. And we're trying to capture this through the context questionnaires. Interacting respectfully. Everybody would agree with this objective, but how do we actually measure this? How do we look at the linguistic, communication and behavioral skills that you need to interact respectfully, to talk with other people, to manage difficulties, breakdowns in communication, to manage conflicts, to mediate between people of different cultures, different languages, the capacity to adapt your own thinking, behavior, and action in a specific context, in a novel situation. That's what makes global competency so important. Young people are going to be confronted with many situations that cannot be possibly predicted by even the best teachers today. How can students learn to appropriately and effectively interact, communicating transparently in their own language, in a style that reduces the risk of the kind of misunderstandings that we often see, building trust, mutual understanding. And those are the kind of things that we've not yet been able to test directly, but that we hope to elicit by confronting students with situations and seeing their reactions to those kinds of contexts. Empathy. Culturally empathic learners can retain their own identity, but at the same time being aware of the cultural values and beliefs of the people with different cultural backgrounds. And that's what we are meaning when we talk about empathy. Not losing your identity by accepting somebody else's views, but remaining yourself, but understanding that other people think are differently. And there are different dimensions to this. This means taking perspective cognitively, involving apprehending and imagining these perceptions, thought, beliefs of other people. It has an affective dimension, involving apprehending and imagining the emotions, feelings, needs of other people, and sympathy, a feeling of compassion and concern for other people based on understanding their cognitive or affective state or condition. That's sort of the dimension of empathy. It's again a dimension we don't yet know how to test and measure directly, but we believe we can confront students with interesting situations that will capture their basically sense of this. Openness to other cultures. Openness involves sensitivity towards, but not only sensitivity, also about curiosity, the willingness to engage with other people and with other perspectives, the willingness to seek out and take up opportunities to engage with people from other cultures, to discover and learn about their cultural perspectives and how they interpret familiar and unfamiliar situations, and to learn about their linguistic features. Maybe also the willingness to suspend my own cultural values, beliefs, and behaviors when I interact with different people. Not to assume that, my behaviors, values are the only ones that exist. Again, something that we believe we can capture is a good set of context questions. The respect for cultural others, positive regard and esteem for someone, something based on the judgment that they have intrinsic importance, worth, value. Not just tolerating something that is different, but seeing the value in this. We define global-mindedness here as a worldview in which one sees oneself as connected to the world community and also feel a sense of responsibility for other members. And that brings me sort of to the last part, responsibility as an attitude towards one's own actions, being reflective about one's actions, forming intentions about how to act in an appropriate way on the basis of a value or set of values. Also holding oneself accountable for the outcomes of those actions. And actually, it's again a dimension that is not new to PISA. PISA has always put a high premium on metacognitive abilities. So we try to capture this in this sense. You heard me mentioning the point of values. And that's, of course, of tremendous difficulty in any international comparison, even national comparison. Values is something that we hold as individuals. How can we embody that perspective in PISA? And indeed, PISA has shied away from defining values. What we put in the center, the sole aspect we put into the center of PISA is actually respect and a belief in human dignity. And you can look at this sort of in two ways. On the one hand, some education systems try a lot to strengthen common core values. At the same time, global competence is about appreciating the diversity of values. Getting that balance right is going to be of fundamental importance for the success of education systems. When you go too far into the direction of strengthening common core values, now you may enforce a very artificial uniformity of values that actually goes counter to people's capacity to acknowledge different perspectives. And that's again a reason why we don't want to go that path in the context of PISA. If we put too much emphasis on a set of, even if they are internationally agreed common core values, we may lose the capacity to see to what extent students are able to see the world's different lenses. But if you go too far in the other direction, an overemphasis on diversity can also undermine the legitimacy of any core values. That risks that sensitivity to other viewpoints descends into complete relativism. So again, getting that balance right is going to be fundamental for the success of PISA's assessment of global competency. And we believe that the answer lies in focusing on respect and a belief in human dignity as the core value underlying global competency, but then basically focusing on diversity rather than on common core values in the context of this assessment. Now, we're not looking at students alone. As always in PISA, we're trying to capture the context in which students learn, teachers teach, and schools operate. So we're also going to use school and teacher questionnaires, trying to elicit teachers' beliefs about diversity and inclusion policies at schools. Already our TELUS survey a couple of years ago has shown us clearly that diversity is seen by most teachers in most countries as the single biggest challenges in their classrooms. Most teachers struggle with rising social and economic diversity in their classrooms, understanding that students learn differently and differently at different stages of their development. We want to see to what extent global issues are covered in the curriculum. And I'm not just talking here about the intended curriculum, what people write into textbooks. We're interested in the implemented curriculum. Now, to what extent do those kinds of global issues, climate change, international conflict, actually articulate in classroom instruction? We look at curriculum coverage of the histories and culture, beliefs, norms, values, customs, rights of diverse cultural groups, and to what extent do countries place emphasis on this? I highlighted before, Canada is a country that is so successful in integrating students with an immigrant background, but actually it's a part of that reflected in the way they design and implement the curriculum. If you're a student with an immigrant background in a classroom in Canada, you're going to see yourself represented in the material. Your cultural identity is actually reflected in the way in what is being taught and how things are being taught. That's not the case in some other countries. We want to look into this. Schools' activities for multicultural learning, cultural events, exchange programs, teachers' practices to facilitate interactions and peer-to-peer learning between different students, school policies to facilitate the integration of immigrants, refugees, non-native speakers, very important today. Teachers' professional experience in training in intercultural communication and in the teaching of multicultural classes. And last but not least, teachers' self-efficacy in multicultural environments. To what extent do teachers have the confidence that they can actually address the challenge of diversity in their context, in their classroom? So at the end of the day, what we're trying to answer is how well students are prepared for life and employment in diverse societies, in the global world in which we live. How much students are exposed to global news and how they understand and critically analyze intercultural and global issues. What approaches to multicultural, intercultural, and global education are actually being deployed, being used in school. The kind of approaches that are used to educate culturally diverse students, and how schools are not only accommodating but leveraging this diversity to develop students' global competency, not seeing diversity as the barrier of the knowledge economy, but as the source of innovation and creativity in today's world. What approaches are used to stimulate peer-to-peer learning between students from different cultures, and how well are schools contesting cultural and gender biases or stereotypes through reasons of their own. That's what we hope to get out of the PISA assessment in 2018, depending on the instruments that we are developing this. Again, this is work at the beginning. What we are doing today is basically putting the assessments on the map, so the framework for the assessment on the map, so that you can have an idea what we're looking after. And we are looking very much forward to engaging the world in a discussion on these kinds of ideas and concepts. Thank you very much.